The notice had been nailed to the post outside the general store in Caldwell, Kansas for 3 days before Mabel Mercer pulled it down, read it twice, folded it into her coat pocket, and walked straight to the livery stable to ask directions to the Holloway ranch. It was the spring of 1882, and the plains of southern Kansas were just beginning to shake off the gray crust of winter. The grasslands rolled outward in every direction like a great brown sea slowly turning green, and the sky above them was so wide and so blue it made a person feel simultaneously humbled and free. Caldwell sat near the Kansas Indian Territory border, a cattle town that had known its share of dust and drama over the years, a place where the Kisham Trail had once poured longhorns through by the tens of thousands. Those big drives were thinning out now, the railheads moving, the open range beginning to close under the pressure of barbed wire and homestead claims, but the land still demanded work, and the people on it still needed hands willing to give it. Mabel was 26 years old, and she had been working since she was old enough to carry a bucket without spilling it. She was not a tall woman, but she was built with a kind of compact, wiry strength that people sometimes mistook for delicateness until they watched her work. Her hair was dark brown, and she kept it pinned beneath a worn felt hat that had belonged to her father. Her eyes were a clear, steady gray, the color of creek water over smooth stones, and they had a way of looking at a person that made them feel they were being measured for something, not unkindly but honestly. She did not waste words. She had spent too many years in situations where wasted words were a luxury she could not afford. She had grown up on a small farm east of Wichita with her father, Thomas Mercer, who had been a fair farmer and a better carpenter, and who had taught her everything he knew about both before a fever took him in the autumn of 1879. After that, Mabel had sold the farm to pay the debts her father had quietly accumulated, and had spent the better part of 3 years moving west and south along the Kansas frontier, taking work wherever she could find it. She had cooked in a boarding house in Wichita. She had helped a ranching family near Medicine Lodge through a brutal winter, doing everything from mending fences to pulling calves. She had driven a supply wagon for a stretch between towns when the regular driver broke his arm. She was not proud or ashamed of any of it. It was simply what her life had required of her, and she had given it willingly. The notice she had pulled from the post read, in handwriting that was blunt and practical rather than elegant, "Wanted, 1 cook and 1 ranch hand. Holloway Ranch, 12 miles northwest of Caldwell. Apply in person. Fair wages for honest work." The notice did not specify any particular requirements beyond willingness and ability. It did not say anything about the applicants needing to be men. Mabel had taken careful note of that. The livery man gave her directions with the mild suspicion of someone who assumed she was going to visit a female relation rather than apply for ranch work, and she thanked him and set out on the road without correcting his assumption. She had a horse, a sturdy roan mare she called Penny, who was better tempered than most people Mabel had known and considerably more reliable. The 12 miles northwest of town unrolled before them in the pale morning light, the road cutting through grassland that was just beginning to push up new shoots, the sky arching enormous overhead. She found the Holloway Ranch without difficulty. It sat in a broad, shallow valley where a creek wound through a stand of cottonwoods, their pale trunks catching the late morning light. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built from limestone blocks, the kind of building that had taken real effort and real intention, not thrown together but put up by someone who meant to stay. There were outbuildings arranged around a central yard, a long bunkhouse, a barn in good repair, a smithy with smoke rising from it, a chicken coop, a kitchen garden plot still showing last year's dead stalks. The fences she could see were tight and well maintained. It was, she noted with approval, a place that was being properly looked after. A man was coming out of the barn when she rode into the yard. He stopped and looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read, something between surprise and wariness. Andrew Holloway was 31 years old and had been running this ranch alone for 2 years, since his father died and left it to him. And before that had been running it alongside his father for 6 years, since coming home from a brief and unhappy attempt at studying law in St. Louis. He was tall and broad across the shoulders, with the kind of lean, durable build that comes from years of physical work. His hair was dark and in need of cutting, and his jaw was rough with several days of growth. His eyes were brown, deep-set, and serious, and they were looking at Mabel now with an undisguised curiosity. He was, in the frank privacy of her own assessment, a good-looking man. She pushed that observation into a small compartment and latched the door firmly. "Morning," she said, swinging down from Penny with easy confidence. "I am looking for Andrew Holloway." "You found him," he said. "I am Mabel Mercer. I have come about the notice you posted in Caldwell." He looked at her steadily for a moment. "The notice for a cook and a ranch hand." "Yes." There was a pause. It was not an unfriendly pause, but it was a considering one. "Miss Mercer," he said, with a careful neutrality that told her he was trying to be fair and not entirely certain how, "I posted that notice expecting to hire 2 men." "I know that," she said pleasantly. "But you posted it for a cook and a hand, not specifically for 2 men. I can do both. I have been cooking for ranch crews and working cattle since I was 17. I am not here to waste your time, Mr. Holloway, and I will ask you not to waste mine. If you are willing to consider me on the basis of what I can actually do, then tell me what you need done and I will show you. If you are not willing to consider me on that basis, then say so plainly and I will ride back to town." Andrew Holloway looked at her for another long moment. The directness of her seemed to catch him slightly off guard, as though he had expected negotiation or pleading and had gotten something entirely different. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth and then settled back into seriousness. "All right," he said. "Come inside." The kitchen of the main house was large and well-equipped by frontier standards, with a good iron range, a dry sink, solid shelving, and a pantry that held substantial stores. He showed it to her with the manner of a man who was slightly embarrassed by the current state of things, and she could see why. The dishes in the dry sink had been there for more than a day. There was hardened grease on the stovetop. A pot on the back burner held the remnants of something that had been beans about a week ago and was now beyond redemption. "I have 3 hands," he said, leaning against the doorframe while she moved through the kitchen with her eyes taking inventory. "Caleb Watts, who has been with me 4 years, Tom Rays, who came on last autumn, and Pete Dunmore, who is 17 and has more enthusiasm than sense at present but is learning. They eat here mornings and evenings. I do the cooking myself currently, and it is not going well." "I can see that," she said without sharpness. "What do you have in the pantry?" he told her. She listened and nodded. "I can have a proper midday meal on the table within 2 hours," she said. "That will tell you whether I can cook. For the ranch work, put me at a task this afternoon and see what I produce. If either falls short of what you need, I will go." "And if both are satisfactory?" he asked. "Then we talk about wages." She turned from the pantry and met his eyes steadily. "I will say to you up front, Mr. Holloway, that I expect to be paid a fair wage for the work I do. Not half a wage because I am a woman." His expression shifted slightly, something moving behind his eyes. "I have not offered you any wage yet," he said. "No. But men in your position often assume a woman should take less, and I am telling you now that I will not." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you consider a fair wage? What were you planning to pay 2 men?" He named a figure. "Have that," she said, "and that is what you should pay me to do both jobs, since I am one person eating one share of provisions, sleeping in one bunk, requiring one set of arrangements. But do not have it on the assumption that I am worth less than a man. Have it only because I am one person doing the work of 2. Andrew Holloway stood in his own kitchen doorway and looked at this woman who had ridden 12 miles to tell him, with perfect calm, exactly how things were going to be, and he felt something he had not felt in a considerable time, a sensation something like being truly awake. "That is a reasonable argument," he said. "I know it is," she said. "Now let me get that pot soaking and see what I can do with a proper fire." He left her to it and went back to the yard, and he stood for a moment outside the barn door looking at the sky with a slightly unfamiliar expression on his face. Caleb Watts, who was 43 and had a weathered face and the unhurried manner of a man who had seen most things twice, came out of the barn and noticed the expression. "Something happened?" he asked. "A woman came about the notice," Andrew said. Caleb waited. "She is in the kitchen." Caleb looked toward the house. "And she told me what her wages would be before I had a chance to offer anything." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without particular inflection, "That might be the most interesting thing that has happened here in 3 years." He picked up his tools and went back to work, and Andrew, after a moment, did the same. At midday, the hands came in from the north pasture where they had been mending fence. Mabel had, in the intervening 2 hours, cleaned the kitchen, disposed of the expired beans, scoured the stovetop, and produced a meal of salt pork with gravy, roasted potatoes from the cellar, corn bread from scratch, and a pot of coffee that was strong and properly made. She set it all on the long table in the dining room off the kitchen with a matter-of-factness that suggested this was simply the standard she operated at, not a performance. Caleb Watts sat down, tasted the cornbread, and looked up at her with open respect. Tom Reyes, who was 28 and the son of a vaquero from South Texas, said in a tone of sincere gratitude that he had not eaten this well since his mother's table. Pete Dunmore, who was indeed 17 with a broad open face and a constant state of happy bewilderment, ate 3 portions and had to be redirected by Caleb before he started on a 4th. Andrew ate without saying much, which Mabel was already learning was simply his manner. He was not cold, she thought, just contained. A man who kept his own counsel until he had something worth saying. She found this neither off-putting nor mysterious. It was, in her experience, one of the more honest ways for a person to be. After the meal, Andrew came to find her in the kitchen where she was already washing up. "That was good," he said. "Thank you. This afternoon I would like you to look at the section of fence along the east pasture. One of the posts has been pulling loose since the ground thawed. Tell me what materials you need and how you would go about fixing it." She wiped her hands on her apron, pulled it off and hung it on the peg near the door, and went to get her coat. He watched her do all this with the same quiet attention she was coming to recognize as habitual in him, not staring, just observing. The fence post turned out to be a simple enough repair, but it had been complicated by the fact that the ground around it had heaved badly over the winter and needed to be properly tamped before the post would hold. She assessed it, told him what she needed, fetched the tools herself, and had the post set properly within an hour and a half. She worked with a focused efficiency that he found himself watching longer than was strictly necessary to evaluate the quality of the work. When she straightened up and drove the last of the tamping rod into the ground, she turned to find him leaning against the fence rail 10 feet away with his arms crossed and his hat tipped back slightly on his head, watching her. "Well," she said, "the job is yours," he said, "both parts of it, at the wage you named." She nodded without triumph or excessive pleasure. "I will need a place to sleep. If there is a room in the house that is suitable, I would prefer that to the bunkhouse. Not because of the company," she added, with the faint dry edge to her voice that he was starting to recognize, "but because the cooking starts before the hands are up and it will be easier to be close to the kitchen." "There is a room off the kitchen," he said. "It was the housekeeper's room when my mother was alive. It is currently full of things that need to be moved, but if you give me an hour this evening I will clear it." "I will help clear it," she said. "You have been working since before midday." "So have you," she said, and picked up the fence tools to carry them back to the barn. He stood there for a moment after she had started walking, and something settled in his chest that he did not immediately examine. He picked up the remaining tools and followed her. That was how it began. The first 2 weeks were purely practical, the way the beginning of any working arrangement must be. Mabel established her routines in the kitchen, and on the ranch with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything, and the household reorganized itself around her presence with a naturalness that surprised everyone, including herself. She was up before dawn every morning to start the fire and get breakfast on. After the hands went out to their work, she would assess the day's priorities, sometimes staying close to the house to manage the bread baking, the laundry, the kitchen garden, the chickens, and sometimes riding out with the crew to work the cattle or attend to whatever needed doing on the range. She was good with cattle, better than Pete and better than Tom in certain ways, though Tom had more years on him. She had grown up working stock, and she had the instinctive ease with animals that some people are simply born with, a quietness around them, a lack of the sharp, sudden movements that made cattle nervous. Caleb noticed this first and mentioned it to Andrew one evening when they were checking on a heifer who had been off her feed. "She has good hands," Caleb said, nodding toward the paddock where Mabel was working with the heifer while Pete held the lantern. "Natural, not learned." "I know it," Andrew said. He had been noticing it since the third day, when he had watched her ease a spooked yearling away from a section of broken fence, with a patience and gentleness that had drawn the animal to her like she was made of grass and calm air. What Andrew was finding more difficult to manage, though he would not have admitted this to Caleb or to anyone, was the simple fact of her. She was the first person to occupy this house as a living daily presence since his father had died, and the house had changed around her in ways he had not anticipated. It smelled different, better, like bread and herbs and coffee, and the faint clean scent of whatever soap she used for her laundry. There were small practical improvements everywhere he looked: a better organized pantry, the kitchen table shifted 6 inches to catch more light from the window, a cracked window latch repaired one morning before anyone else was up. She did not ask permission for any of these changes. She simply saw what needed doing and did it. He found himself listening for her in the mornings. The sound of her moving in the kitchen before the rest of the house was awake had become, in a span of 2 weeks, something his sleeping mind began to anticipate. He would sometimes sit at the kitchen table in the early morning with his second cup of coffee, not because he needed the coffee, but because she was there, and the kitchen at that hour was warm, and she talked to him in the flat, honest way she had about the work or the cattle or the weather or whatever was in her mind. And he found this exchange, these 20 or 30 minutes of plain morning talk before the world pressed in, to be something he looked forward to in a way that unsettled him. He was not a man who became easily unsettled. He told himself it was simply the natural effect of competent company. He had been alone in this house for too long and had grown too accustomed to his own thoughts. Having someone capable and direct around naturally made the place feel more alive. That was all it was. He told himself this with some regularity. On a Tuesday morning in early April, 3 weeks after her arrival, a situation arose that was, in Andrew's view, perfectly illustrative of who Mabel Mercer was. 2 men rode into the yard from the South Road before breakfast was finished. They were hard-faced men, neither young, with the look of hired muscle rather than working cowboys. They sat their horses with a loose arrogance that Andrew recognized and did not like. The larger of the 2 asked for Andrew Holloway by name, and when Andrew came out to the yard, the man introduced himself as being employed by a rancher named Garrett Pine, who owned a larger spread 15 miles south, and who had been, for the better part of a year, pressuring Andrew to sell the eastern third of the Holloway land, which sat adjacent to Pine's water rights. Andrew had declined this pressure twice before in written correspondence and once in person. He declined it again now, standing in his own yard with his hands at his sides and his voice level. The 2 men said what men in that position generally said, nothing directly threatening, nothing that could be repeated in front of a judge, but with an undercurrent that made its meaning perfectly clear. What Andrew had not anticipated was Mabel appearing on the porch behind him with a Winchester rifle, which she held with a relaxed competence that was, given her general demeanor, entirely unsurprising in retrospect. She did not point it at anyone. She simply stood there with it and looked at the two men with her clear gray eyes and said, pleasantly, "Breakfast is on the table, Mr. Holloway. These gentlemen appear to be leaving." The two men looked at her for a moment. They looked at Andrew. They looked at each other. The larger one said in a tone that tried to be dismissive and did not quite manage it, "Mr. Pine will be in touch again." "Mr. Pine is welcome to put anything he has to say in writing," Andrew said. They left. Andrew turned to look at Mabel, who was already lowering the rifle and turning back toward the kitchen door. "You did not need to do that," he said. "I know," she said, "but it was faster." She went inside. He stood on the porch step for a moment, and what he felt was not the simple gratitude of an employer for a capable employee. He knew the difference. He went inside and sat down at the breakfast table and ate his eggs and said nothing about it, because he needed to think before he spoke. Caleb, who had watched the whole exchange from the barn door, simply picked up his fork and said to Tom Rays quietly, "Told you." Tom nodded. "You did," Pete said. "Told him what?" And received no answer. The trouble with Garrett Pine did not resolve itself easily or quickly. He was a powerful man in that part of the county, wealthy, connected to the right people in Caldwell and Wichita, and accustomed to getting what he wanted through the simple application of sustained pressure. He had bought out 3 smaller ranches along the creek corridor in the past 4 years, and the Holloway land was the last significant piece that sat between his holdings and the reliable water source that would allow him to significantly expand his herd. Andrew had no desire to sell, not because he was being stubborn, but because this land was his family's land, built by his parents over 20 years of hard work, and it was good land, well watered and well managed, and it was his. He had not left St. Louis and his brief, unhappy attempt at becoming someone he was not, and come back here, just to let a man like Pine squeeze him out. Mabel learned the full shape of this problem over the course of the following weeks, in the way that information flows naturally when people are working closely together. She heard it from Andrew in their early morning conversations, and she heard parts of it from Caleb, who had a careful kind of loyalty to the Holloways that manifested in blunt honesty rather than flattery. "Pine has friends at the county land office," Caleb told her one morning while they were working together in the kitchen garden, she planting and he mending the tool handles because Caleb, who had bad knees, had taken to finding reasons to be nearby when there was lighter work. He has been suggesting that there are questions about the deed to the east section, claims there was some ambiguity in the original filing. Andrew's father filed clean and proper, but the original surveyor died 2 years ago, and the paperwork has gone through 2 offices since, and things in county offices have a way of getting moved around when someone with money wants them moved. Mabel sat back on her heels and looked at him. "Does Andrew have copies of all the original filings?" Caleb looked at her. "I do not know." She went inside and knocked on the door of the room Andrew used as an office, a small room off the main parlor that was organized with the same contained practicality he brought to everything. He was at the desk working on the accounts. She asked her question. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that told her the question had hit something. "I have some of them," he said. "You need all of them. If Pine is making claims about the filing, the only defense is the original documents. Your father would have had the county file a certified copy when the deed was registered. That copy should still be at the county recorder's office in Wellington, not just the Caldwell branch. If Pine has been interfering at the local office, he may not have reached Wellington." Andrew looked at her for a moment. "How do you know about county land filing procedures?" "My father was a farmer who lost part of his land to a filing dispute when I was 12, she said. "He spent 2 years and most of what we had trying to recover it and never did. I made a point of learning how the system works." He was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man recalibrating something. "You think I should go to Wellington?" "I think you should write to the county recorder there first and ask for certified copies of all original filings on this parcel. Do it in writing through the post so there is a record of the request. If Pine has influence in the local office, he has less in Wellington. The state capitol recorder in Topeka is the final authority. If you can get your originals certified at both county and state level, a claim of filing ambiguity becomes very difficult to sustain. Andrew looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, "Were you planning to become a lawyer at some point?" Something that was almost a smile crossed her face, brief and genuine. "No, I was planning to keep my land. That turned out to require much of the same knowledge." He wrote to Wellington that afternoon. The reply, when it came 3 weeks later, confirmed that the original filings were there, intact, certified, and clearly in the name of Thomas Holloway and his heirs. Andrew had the certified copies sent to him, and he had them filed with the county office in Caldwell in a formal submission that made their contents a matter of public record. When Garrett Pine's lawyer appeared at the county office 2 weeks after that to press the ambiguity claim, he found the record already settled and the ground cut out from under him. Pine did not give up, but the legal threat was gone, and without it his pressure was merely unpleasant rather than dangerous. Andrew sent a final letter to Pine's office making clear that the land was not for sale, and that any further attempts at interference would be met with appropriate legal action. He did not hear from Pine's men again. On the evening he received the final confirmation from the county office, Andrew came into the kitchen where Mabel was finishing up the supper dishes. He stood in the doorway for a moment and she looked at him over her shoulder and read his face easily enough by now to know that something had resolved. "Wellington came through," she said. "Pine's lawyer left the county office today without a case." She turned back to the dishes. "Good, Mabel." His voice was different. She turned again. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, turning the brim between his fingers in a way she had come to recognize as the physical expression of something he was working through, something he was not yet sure how to say. "I want you to know," he said, "that I am aware that this resolution came from what you told me to do. I would not have thought to check Wellington. I would have been spending the next 2 years fighting a losing battle at the local office." She looked at him for a moment. "You would have figured it out eventually. Maybe, not as quickly." A pause. "I am grateful." "You do not need to be," she said, though her voice had softened slightly. "It is your land and it should stay yours. That seems straightforwardly correct to me." Still, he held her gaze for a moment, and there was something in his expression that was quiet and serious and more personal than professional, and Mabel, who had been very carefully managing the distance between the practical and the personal since the day she arrived, felt it close by a degree she had not entirely anticipated. She looked back at the dishes. "Supper was good," he said in a lighter tone, apparently deciding to step back from the edge of the moment. "It was leftover stew and cornbread. It was very good leftover stew and cornbread." She heard the faint, deliberate humor in his voice and felt, against her careful management, something warm and unhelpful. "Good night, Mr. Holloway," she said. A pause. "Good night, Miss Mercer." He did not leave immediately. She could feel him still in the doorway for a moment longer, and then his footsteps moved down the hall toward the parlor, and she let out a breath she had not noticed she was holding and applied herself very firmly to the supper dishes. May came and brought with it the full force of a Kansas spring, violent thunderstorms rolling in off the plains at night, days of sharp, clear light afterward, where the grass was so green it looked almost unreal, the cottonwoods along the creek bursting into their pale shimmer. It was beautiful country, and Mabel, who had moved so many times that she had stopped fully allowing herself to belong to any particular place, found herself noticing its beauty in a way she had not done with a landscape in some years. She noticed it particularly on mornings, when she rode out early to check on the south pasture fence before the rest of the ranch was fully awake. There was an hour at first light when the plains had a quality of absolute stillness, broken only by bird song and the wind through the grass, and she would sit on Penny at the top of a small rise and look out across the valley, where the creek shone through the cottonwoods and the ranch buildings sat solid and purposeful in the early light, and she would feel something she recognized, with some caution, as something that was beginning to resemble home. Andrew sometimes found her there on those early morning rides. He did not always join her, but sometimes he did, and they would ride together in companionable silence along the fence line, pointing out what needed attention, or they would stop at the rise, and she would find him beside her looking at the same view with a quiet expression. She could not entirely read, but that seemed, in its way, to mirror something of what she was feeling. It was on one such morning in the second week of May that he said, without preamble and without looking at her, "I have been meaning to say something to you for a while." She waited. "When you came here," he said, "you told me not to pay you half wages because you were a woman. You told me to pay you half only because you were one person doing two jobs." "Yes. I have been thinking about that, about how you put it." He was still looking out over the valley. "You were right that it was a reasonable argument. You were also right that men in my position often assume a woman ought to take less. I want you to know that I am aware that what you did in coming here, riding 12 miles alone to apply for work that most men would have refused to let you do, was not a small thing. And I want you to know that the wage I am paying you, I would pay the same to any person who did what you do here as well as you do it." Mabel looked at his profile for a moment. He had not looked at her yet. "Thank you," she said. "That is a genuinely decent thing to say." He turned to look at her then, and they were close enough on the narrow rise that she could see the full character of his face in the early light, the seriousness and the intelligence, and something beneath both of those that was more vulnerable than his usual contained manner revealed. "You are also," he said carefully, "more than what I hired." The silence between them stretched out for a moment. Below in the valley, a red-tailed hawk lifted out of the cottonwoods and turned in a long, slow spiral upward on the morning thermals. Penny shifted slightly beneath her. "I am what I am," she said at last, which was neither an acknowledgment nor a deflection, but simply the truth. He nodded, as though she had said something settled and complete, and turned his horse back toward the ranch. She followed after a moment, and neither of them spoke again on the ride back, but the space between them on the trail felt different than it had before, charged in some quiet way, like the air before one of those May thunderstorms that came rolling in off the plains. It was Tom Rays who first said something about it directly, and he said it to Caleb, and Caleb told Mabel, which Tom had fully anticipated and intended. Tom was not a gossip by nature, but he was a practical man, and he had been watching two people dance carefully around something for 6 weeks with the patience of a man who had grown up watching his parents do the same before they finally, as he put it to Caleb, got sensible. Caleb told Mabel one afternoon while they were working on the south pasture fence, not in a gossiping way, but in a direct and practical way, the way Caleb did everything. He said, "Tom thinks you and Andrew are going to waste an entire season not saying what is obvious to everyone who lives on this property. And Tom is, in my experience, generally right about people." Mabel drove a staple into a fence post with 3 clean hammer blows. "Does Tom run the ranch or does Andrew?" "Andrew," Caleb said, "but Tom has working eyes." She moved to the next post without answering. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, not unkindly, "He has been alone a long time. His father was a good man, and Andrew ran this place with him for 6 years and then ran it by himself for 2. He does not show a great deal of what he feels, but he is not a man without feeling. He shows what he feels by doing, by how he works, by what he does not say as much as what he does." Mabel set down her hammer and looked at the fence line stretching away through the grass. "I know," she said quietly. "I am not unaware of any of this, Caleb. I know you are not. I simply," she said and paused and started again with the careful honesty that characterized her, "have learned to be cautious about what I allow myself to want, because I have lost what I wanted before, and because this is my job and my home right now and I am not willing to risk it carelessly." Caleb nodded slowly. "That is a sensible thing to be aware of." "Yes. But you can be sensible and still be wrong about what is worth risking." She looked at him. He had the calm, weathered face of a man who had thought about most things more thoroughly than his silences suggested. "You are more philosophical than you let on," she said. "I am old," he said simply. "You accumulate things." He picked up his tools and moved on down the fence line, and Mabel stood for a moment in the May sunshine with the smell of grass and warm earth around her, and the distant sound of cattle and the hawk still circling somewhere overhead. And she thought about caution, and about what it was worth, and whether it was always the same thing as wisdom. She did not reach any immediate conclusions, but something had shifted slightly in her. A small door she had been holding carefully shut had come open by the width of a finger's breadth. The event that finally broke open the careful distance between them had nothing dramatic or planned about it. It happened on a Friday evening in late May, when a late spring storm came in fast from the northwest, the kind that did not announce itself properly but simply arrived, and arrived hard. Andrew and Tom were still out in the north pasture when it hit, and Mabel, who had been watching the sky since late afternoon with the animal instinctiveness of someone who had grown up on the plains, had already sent Pete to warn them and ridden out herself to help push the cattle in from the exposed section before the lightning got serious. The three of them got the cattle in and the horses settled and made it back to the barn in a full downpour, soaked through, the lightning cracking close enough to feel in the ground. They worked in the barn by lantern light for another half-hour, seeing to the horses and the barn doors, and when the worst of it had passed and Tom and Pete had gone to the bunkhouse, Andrew and Mabel were left alone in the barn in the particular silence that comes after a storm, rain still drumming on the roof but softening, the horses calm and breathing in their stalls. She was wringing water from her braid, standing near the lantern, and when she straightened and looked up he was right there, closer than she had realized, and his face in the lantern light was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, all the careful containment washed away by the adrenaline of the storm and the rain and the hours of hard, urgent work beside her, and he was looking at her with something so simple and so direct that her careful internal management did not have time to engage. "Mabel," he said. "Andrew," she said, and her voice came out quiet and certain, the way it did when she knew the right answer to something. "I need to say something," he said. "All right. I hired you to cook and to work, and you do both better than anyone I have ever employed, and that is true and it matters, but it is not what I need to say." She waited. The rain drummed softly on the roof. A horse shifted in the nearest stall. "I need to say that I have been thinking about you since about the third day you were here, and not in any way that is about the work, and I am aware that makes your position here complicated, and I am not saying it to complicate it. I am saying it because you are the most honest person on this ranch and you deserve honesty in return." She stood very still. "What kind of thinking?" she asked, and her voice was calm but she could hear her own heart. "The kind that makes the morning coffee taste better than it has any right to," he said, with a roughness in his voice that was the closest thing to vulnerability she had heard from him. "The kind that makes me find reasons to be in the same room. The kind that makes me want to know every single thing you think about everything." Mabel looked at him for a long moment in the lantern light, with the rain settling around them and the warmth of the horses and the smell of wet hay, and the particular feeling she had been trying not to name for 6 weeks spreading out from her chest, until it was simply too large to keep in its careful compartment. "I have been doing the same kind of thinking," she said. His breath came out. It was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh, but something between the two, relief and something like joy in it. He reached out and took her hand, her work-roughened, capable, entirely competent hand, and held it between both of his. "I do not know how to do this carefully," he said. "I am more accustomed to the parts of life that have clear instructions." "I know," she said. "I have been observing that about you." There was the faint, dry edge to her voice that she knew he had been learning, and she watched him smile, a full and genuine smile that changed his face completely, opened it up into something warm and young and very appealing. She had been hoping to see that smile aimed at her in that particular way for some time and had refused to admit it. "Neither of us is reckless," she said. "We can be careful and honest at the same time. That seems like a sufficient starting place." "It seems like an excellent starting place," he said. He lifted her hand slightly and pressed it for a moment, then released it, because they were both people who understood patience, and they stood together in the lantern-lit barn, while the last of the storm passed over and the stars began to appear through the opening clouds, and something settled into place between them with the unhurried solidity of a fence post tamped into good ground. June arrived, and with it the full warmth of a Kansas summer, the grass going gold at the edges, the days long and blue and full of work. The cattle were healthy, the pastures in good shape, the ranch running with the smooth efficiency of a place that has the right people in it. And between Mabel and Andrew something was developing that was both simple and profound, the way things are when they grow naturally out of genuine mutual knowledge rather than romantic invention. They were together in the particular way of two people who are already accustomed to each other's company, and are now simply allowing what was already there to be named. He would find her in the kitchen garden in the evenings and sit on the fence rail and talk about the cattle or the accounts or the particular quality of the sunset while she weeded. And it was the plainest and most comfortable kind of courtship, built on the foundation of everything they already knew about each other. He took her to town one Saturday in the wagon, ostensibly for supplies, which was also genuinely necessary, and she sat beside him on the wagon bench with the summer morning rolling out around them and the town of Caldwell appearing ahead in its familiar dusty arrangement of buildings, and she was aware of the looks they received when they walked through the general store together, and she held on to her own sense of it, which was that this was a man worth the walk, and the looks were other people's concern, not hers. There was a woman in the general store named Louise Painter who ran the millinery next door, and who knew everyone's business, and was not shy about demonstrating it. She fixed Mabel with a bright, assessing look while Andrew was talking to the storekeeper about a fencing order, and said, with the particular social fluency of someone who is technically being friendly while administering a test, "I hear you have been working out at the Holloway place, Miss Mercer. A rather unusual arrangement, I understand." Mabel bought her needles and thread and looked at Louise Painter with her clear gray eyes. "I cook and I work cattle," she said pleasantly. "The arrangement is that I do both jobs well and am paid accordingly. I'm not certain what is unusual about that." Louise Painter blinked. "Well, most women," she began. "I know what most women do," Mabel said still pleasantly. "I'm not most women." Andrew from across the store had heard enough to know how the exchange had gone, and when they came back out into the street and she climbed up onto the wagon bench with the ease of someone who has never once required a hand she did not ask for, he said, "Was that necessary?" "Yes," she said. "I could have," he started. "I know you could have," she said. "That is not the same as it being necessary for you to." She settled the package of supplies on her lap and looked forward down the main street with the satisfaction of a person who has said what needed to be said. He looked at her profile for a moment, the line of her jaw and her straight back and her hat tipped slightly against the morning sun, and he felt that sensation again, the one he had been feeling with increasing regularity, of being thoroughly and completely awake. He drove the wagon forward and let the matter rest where she had put it, which was exactly right. July brought heat and work, and the slow deepening of everything that had been starting in the spring. One evening after supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the house had settled into its evening quiet, Andrew came and sat in the kitchen while Mabel finished the dishes, which had become a habit of evenings that neither of them had commented on but neither had moved to change. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and watched her work and said, in the considered tone of a man who has been building up to something, "I have been thinking about the future of this ranch." She set a plate on the shelf and reached for the next one. "What about it?" "About what it requires to sustain it properly, beyond what we have now." A pause. "About what I want it to be." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was looking at his coffee cup, turning it slowly. "Andrew," she said, setting down her dishcloth because she recognized the texture of this conversation and she was not going to let him circle it indefinitely. If you have something to say, say it. He looked up at her. I am not good at this, he said. You are doing fine. I want to ask you something, and I am aware that it is the kind of question that changes things, and I would rather it change them in one direction than the other. But I want you to know that regardless of your answer, what you are to this ranch and to me is not contingent on what you answer. Your job is your job, and it does not depend on this. She came and sat down across from him at the kitchen table. In the lamplight, his face was serious and earnest, and the vulnerability in it was unguarded in a way she had learned to recognize as the real Andrew Holloway speaking, rather than the contained and capable version he showed the world. Ask me, she said. He met her eyes. I would like you to stay, he said. Not as the cook, not as the ranch hand, as my wife if you will have me. Because I love you, Mabel. I have been trying not to say that for 3 months, and I am done trying not to say it. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the nighthawks were calling in the warm summer dark, and somewhere down by the creek the frogs were going. The lamplight fell between them on the table, warm and steady. Mabel sat with her hands folded in front of her and looked at Andrew Holloway, this man she had come to know with the kind of thorough knowledge that only comes from sharing daily life with someone, the work of him, the consideration of him, the quiet humor and the contained passion and the deep fundamental decency of him, and she felt what she felt with a clarity that had nothing careful or managed about it. I love you too, she said. I have been doing my best not to for some time, and I have been failing at it since approximately April. He laughed, a full genuine sound that the kitchen had not heard enough of, and she laughed with him, and then he was standing and she was standing and his arms were around her, and she was against his chest with her face turned up to his, and the first time he kissed her it was warm and certain and unhurried, the way everything real and lasting begins. They stayed in the kitchen for a long while that evening, talking in the low, warm voices of people who have stepped through some door and are now taking stock of the new country on the other side. He told her things about his childhood on this land that he had not told anyone since his father died. She told him about her father's farm and the year after he died, and what it had been like to be entirely alone with nothing but her own capacity to rely on. And he listened with the complete attention of a man who was not planning to let her be alone again, and who understood that she was not asking for rescue, but simply being known. When she finally stood to go to her room, he held her hand for a moment in the kitchen doorway and said, I will speak to the preacher in Caldwell this week. When would you like to be married? She considered. September, she said. When the summer work is through and the ranch is properly settled for the season. September, he agreed. She went to her room and lay in the dark with the summer nighthawks calling outside her window and the ranch she had made her own settled around her, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, entirely at peace. September came in dry and golden, the way the best of Kansas falls arrive, the sky deepening to a blue that was almost painful in its clarity, the cottonwoods along the creek turning their first pale yellow, the grass cured to a warm amber in the long afternoons. The ranch was in good order. The cattle were in prime condition for the fall market. The fences were tight, the barns were stocked, the accounts were in the best shape they had been since Andrew's father's time, in no small part because 2 minds were working on them instead of one. The wedding was held on the 23rd of September, 1882, in the First Methodist Church in Caldwell, which was a modest building but a sound one. The Reverend was a patient man who had married dozens of frontier couples and understood that ceremony and sentiment were not in conflict but in partnership. Andrew wore a suit that had been his father's and that he had taken in slightly at the waist, and he stood at the front of the church with the same contained gravity he brought to everything, except that his eyes, when they found Mabel coming down the aisle in the deep blue dress she had made herself over the course of August evenings, lost every particle of containment entirely. Mabel walked down the aisle of that small church with her dark hair pinned up beneath a wreath of dried wildflowers and her gray eyes clear and steady and calm, and she felt no uncertainty, and no hesitation. Only the clean, pure certainty of a woman doing exactly what she means to do. Caleb Watts sat in the front pew with the upright posture of a man taking an occasion seriously, and beside him Tom Rays, who had pressed his good shirt without being asked. Pete Dunmore sat beside Tom and was doing his level best not to cry, with mixed results. There were neighbors who had come, the families from the surrounding ranches and farms who constituted the community of that stretch of county, people who had known Andrew for years and who were seeing Mabel for the first time in this context, and who would tell this story later as one of their county's notable romances. A man who put up a notice for a cook and a hand, and a woman who showed up able to do both and refused half the wage. That story had traveled, as stories in small communities do, and there was a warmth in that small church that afternoon that had to do with more than the September sunlight coming through the windows. The Reverend spoke about partnership and about the particular grace of two people who come to each other as equals, and Andrew thought he saw Mabel's lips curve slightly at that phrase, and he understood exactly what she was thinking, because he was thinking the same thing. They spoke their vows in steady voices, and when the Reverend said the words and pronounced them married and Andrew took her face in his hands and kissed her right there, in front of the church full of neighbors, Pete Dunmore finally lost his battle with his composure, and Caleb pretended not to notice while passing him a handkerchief. The celebration afterward was held in the yard of the ranch, because Mabel had looked at the size of the church, and the size of the guest list, and the size of her kitchen and determined that the yard was the only sensible option. Tables were set up under the cottonwoods and loaded with food that she had spent 2 days preparing, assisted cheerfully and with varying levels of competence by Mrs. Clara Whitman, the wife of the neighboring rancher to the north, who had brought 2 pies and considerable goodwill. There was music from a fiddle player named Pete Sorensen, who was old and who played beautifully. And as the afternoon stretched into evening and the stars came out over the Kansas plains, people danced in the grass between the tables and the firelight, and the night had the quality of something both simple and perfect. Andrew danced with Mabel 3 times, which given his general relationship to dancing was a significant commitment, and the 3rd time he held her in the circle of his arms with the firelight warm around them and said quietly against her hair, "How did you know?" "Know what?" she said. "That this was worth riding 12 miles for." She was quiet for a moment. "I did not know what this was when I rode those 12 miles, she said honestly. "I knew the work was worth it. I found out the rest after." He tightened his arms around her for a moment. "I am very glad you posted that notice somewhere I would see it," she said, and she felt him laugh against her hair. "I am very glad you pulled it down," he said. The guests went home in the late evening, and the yard was cleaned and quieted, and the ranch settled into the deep silence of a September night, and Andrew and Mabel Holloway were alone in the house that was now fully and completely both of theirs, and what happened next was private and tender, and entirely their own. The years that followed were the kind of years that constitute a life actually lived. They were not without difficulty, because no years on the frontier were without difficulty, but they were good years, solid and full and built on the right foundation. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a hard one, the cold coming early and staying late, but the ranch was well prepared, and they came through it without significant loss. Mabel had quietly rearranged the kitchen stores in October so that they were provisioned for 6 months rather than 4, having grown up knowing that the plains did not give you advance notice of how long a hard winter would run. Andrew, who had always provisioned to his own standard and thought it adequate, observed this additional preparation with the private acknowledgement that her standard was better. In the spring of 1883, they discovered that Mabel was expecting their first child. She told him in the morning, in the kitchen, in the same direct way she told him everything, and he sat down in his kitchen chair rather harder than intended and looked at her with an expression of such transparent joy that she laughed and had to look away to collect herself. "Are you all right?" he said. He was on his feet immediately, which she had anticipated. "I am perfectly fine," she said. "I am healthy and the work I do is good for me, and I intend to keep doing it for most of the pregnancy. I am not made of glass. No one has ever thought that about you," he said with sincerity. "Good. Now sit down and have your breakfast before it gets cold." He sat down, but he looked at her for the rest of breakfast with a warmth that she felt on her face and refused to react to, mostly because her own feelings on the subject were large enough that she needed to keep them carefully in check, or she would be entirely useless for the day. Their son was born in November of 1883, delivered by Mrs. Clara Whitman, who had more experience with frontier births than the nearest doctor 20 miles away, and who was considerably more reliable in a crisis. He was a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and they named him Thomas Andrew Holloway, for both their fathers, which seemed right and necessary to both of them. Andrew held his son for the first time with the same careful, contained gravity he brought to everything consequential, and then looked at Mabel, who was exhausted and very much herself, watching him with the watchful gray eyes, and he said, "He is perfect." His voice was rough. "He looks like you," she said. "He has your eyes." "Then he is fortunate," she said, and he laughed and leaned down and kissed her forehead with such tenderness that she had to close her eyes and just let it be. Caleb, when informed that he had what he immediately declared a kind of surrogate nephew to look forward to watching grow up, went out to the barn and spent an hour there by himself, which everyone understood to be his way of managing strong feeling. He came back in and made a practical speech about the importance of starting children early with livestock, which Tom Rays listened to with the expression of a man biting down on a smile. Pete Dunmore, now 18 and coming into his own as a genuine ranch hand, was beside himself with delight and had to be redirected twice from the topic of baby horses before he settled down. He was, as Andrew observed to Mabel, the same as he had always been, just taller. Tom Rays, who had been sending money home to his mother in South Texas since he arrived, told Andrew that spring that he was thinking about going back south to help her with a small spread she had been trying to keep going since his father's death. Andrew told him that his place at the Holloway Ranch was open whenever he wanted it, and that he was a good man, and his mother was fortunate. Tom shook his hand and said that he hoped to bring a woman back north one day, and that he'd heard the territory was opening up for good land claims. He left in April, and Mabel packed him provisions for the road, and he rode south on a warm spring morning with his wages and his dignity and his considerable skill, and they wished him well entirely. They hired a new hand named Samuel Bright, who was 22 and from Illinois and earnest in the extreme, and who turned out to have a gift for working with horses that was remarkable enough to compensate for his otherwise general inexperience. He settled into the bunkhouse and the routine of the ranch with gratifying ease. Little Thomas, called Tom after his grandfather, was walking by 14 months and talking in full sentences by 22, which Mabel attributed to the fact that he was talked to like a person from birth rather than talked at like a small, mysterious animal. He followed his father around the yard from the time he could walk with a focused determination that was so recognizably his mother in expression, and his father in direction that watching them together was a particular pleasure for everyone on the ranch. In the spring of 1885, Mabel discovered she was expecting again. She told Andrew in the kitchen again in the morning again, and this time he did not sit down hard in his chair but came directly to her and held her face in his hands and said, "How are you feeling?" "Very well," she said. "Stop looking at me like that." "How am I looking at you?" "Like you are planning to carry me everywhere." "I would not say everywhere," he said, with the dry humor that had developed in him over these years of living alongside her, a humor that had always been there but had been freed by her into something warm and daily. "Only the longer distances." She pushed his hands gently away and went back to the stove. "Go see to the horses." "In a moment," he said, and stayed where he was, Watching her at the stove with his heart so full of her, it was a wonder he managed the ordinary tasks of any given day. Their daughter was born in October of 1885, a strong and vocal arrival who announced herself to the entire household and barn with considerable authority. They named her Clara Eliza Holloway, for Mrs. Whitman, who had delivered both children with competence and warmth, and for Mabel's mother, who had died when Mabel was young but whose name she had carried close all her life. Clara had her mother's dark brown hair and her father's brown eyes, and from the first days of her life had a quality of vivid presence that suggested she was going to be, as Caleb put it with mild understatement, a great deal of person in whatever space she occupied. Caleb Watts, who was now approaching 50 and whose bad knees were increasingly vocal about fence work, had moved into something between senior hand and general advisor and honorary family member, a role that no one had explicitly defined, but that everyone recognized. He taught Tom to sit a horse properly. He watched Clara with the expression of a man trying not to become entirely devoted to a baby and failing completely. He was the one who sat up with Andrew the nights when the cattle were in distress and the work was long, and who knew without needing to be told when to speak and when to be silent, which was the most valuable skill a man could have. In 1886, a letter arrived from Tom Rays. He had married a woman named Lucia in South Texas, and they were coming north with her 2 brothers to look at homestead claims in the open territory. He asked if Andrew knew the land situation along the creek south of Caldwell. Andrew wrote back with everything he knew about available claims and told him there was a bunk and a table at the Holloway Ranch whenever they passed through. Tom Rays arrived in June of that year with Lucia, who was small and fierce and beautiful, and who took one look at Mabel Holloway and said, in a tone of clear recognition, "You are the woman who made that man write to the land office in Wellington." Mabel looked at her with surprise. Tom, from behind his wife, said, "I told her the story when we were courting. She said if Andrew Holloway had a woman like that on his ranch, he had better keep her." Mabel and Lucia sat in the kitchen for 2 hours that first afternoon and talked with the ease of 2 women who have both spent their lives doing more than the world expected of them and have both found, in their respective ways, men worth the finding. Andrew and Tom sat on the porch and listened to the sound of the 2 women in the kitchen and the sound of the children in the yard and the sound of the ranch in its full summer warmth, and Andrew said, "She told you about Wellington." "The night I asked her to sit with me after supper for the first time," Tom said. "She said any man who had a woman smart enough to save his land was a man worth working for. She was deciding about me, I think, based on who I had chosen to work for." Andrew was quiet for a moment. "That seems about right," he said. Tom and Lucia filed on a homestead claim 15 miles south in the fall of that year, not far from where the Pine Ranch sat, and Garrett Pine, who had discovered over the intervening years that the Holloways were not going to be pressured or bought out, had redirected his expansionary ambitions eastward. He was still a large and influential rancher, but he had learned the boundaries of what was going to move and what was not. The Holloway Ranch continued to grow carefully and properly over the following years. Not with the explosive acquisition of someone chasing scale for its own sake, but with the steady expansion of a place that knew what it was and was becoming more fully itself. A second barn went up in 1887. The kitchen garden was expanded substantially. The east pasture, the one that Pine had wanted and that the Wellington filing had secured, was put to better use with a careful management of grass rotation that Andrew had been reading about and that Mabel had immediately seen the logic of and helped implement. Tom Holloway, at 5 years old, could name every cow in the South herd by sight and had strong opinions about which of the horses was smartest. Clara, at 2, had strong opinions about everything and expressed them clearly, which her father found hilarious, and her mother found both amusing and somewhat familiar. Caleb maintained that Clara had been sent specifically to teach the adults of the household patience, and that this was a divine arrangement. Pete Dunmore had grown into a good, steady man, and was thinking seriously about a woman in Caldwell named Ruth who worked in the dry goods store and who was, in Pete's earnest assessment, the finest person in the county after Mrs. Holloway. Mabel had met Ruth twice and liked her enormously and told Pete, when he asked somewhat indirectly for her opinion, that a woman who knew her own mind was worth pursuing with the same directness and honesty you would want her to apply to you. Pete took this advice with the gravity of a man receiving scripture and rode to town the following Saturday. He came back engaged. He was 23 and Ruth was 21, and they were, as Caleb observed, perfectly suited, which in Caleb's language meant they were good for each other. The wedding was in the spring, and the Holloways attended, and Mabel danced with Andrew on the floor of the Caldwell dance hall and thought about their own September wedding 6 years past and how little and how much had changed. What had changed was everything circumstantial. The house, the children, the years of work and growth, and the shape their life had taken together. What had not changed was the essential quality of what was between them, which had, if anything, deepened with each year and each difficulty, and each ordinary evening in the kitchen with the lamp between them. He still sat with his coffee at the kitchen table on mornings when the work had not yet pressed in, and she still talked to him about whatever was in her mind, and he still listened with the complete attention she had valued from the beginning. She still rode out early on certain mornings to the rise above the valley, and he still sometimes found her there and joined her. On one such morning in the autumn of 1888, 6 years after she had ridden into his yard with the folded notice in her coat pocket, they sat side by side on their horses at the top of the rise and looked down at the ranch below them, at the solid limestone house with smoke rising from the kitchen chimney, at the barns and the bunkhouse and the kitchen garden's autumn remains, at the cottonwoods blazing yellow along the creek, at the cattle moving through the far pasture in the early light, at the entirely legible outlines of a life built together from the ground up. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said in your notice, that you wanted a cook and a hand?" "I remember," he said. "I remember everything about you arriving. You looked like you were not certain what to do with me. I was not. I had expected 2 men, and got 1 woman. And got 1 woman," he said, "who turned out to be better than the 2 men I expected." She tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was deciding whether to accept something or push back on it. She decided to accept it. "You were never going to have my wage," she said. "Were you? I said the thing about not having it and you listened, and then you said it was a reasonable argument, but you were not going to have it regardless." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "I was not." "Why did you let me make the argument then?" "Because you had clearly prepared it and it was a good argument and you deserved to make it. Also," a pause, "because I wanted to hear how you thought." She looked at him. He was looking out over the valley with the particular expression, serious and warm at the same time, that she had come to know as well as her own hands. "You were thinking about me from the first day," she said. "From the moment you rode into the yard," he said. "I have never told you that." "From the first second. I took one look at you getting down from that horse, and I thought I was in some serious difficulty." She laughed, a full, genuine sound that rose into the morning air. He turned and looked at her laughing, and his face was entirely open with love for her, with the easy certainty of a man who knows where he is and where he belongs. "Serious difficulty," she said. "The most pleasant kind," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking down at the ranch, at the smoke from the chimney that meant the house was warm and the children would be waking soon and the day was beginning in its full and ordinary richness. "I knew too," she said, "from early. I spent a very great deal of effort not knowing." "I noticed," he said. "You could have said something earlier." "You would have managed the distance another 6 months," he said, with the dry precision of a man who had observed her at close range for a long time. "Yes," she admitted, "probably. I knew when the storm broke you. It did not break me. It did not, but it moved you." She considered this. "It moved me," she allowed. He put his hand out toward her and she took it. They're on horseback at the top of the rise above their valley, the autumn morning around them, the ranch and the children and the years of their life spread out below and behind and ahead. "Mabel," he said. "Andrew," she said. "I want you to know," he said, "that every single morning since the day you arrived has been better than the one before it. That is not sentiment, it is an observation." She squeezed his hand once firmly. "So is this," she said. "You are the best man I have ever known, and I have known that since April of 1882, and I was simply being careful." He brought her hand up and pressed it to his lips for a moment, the gesture unself-conscious and unhurried, the way all their truest moments were. Then they turned their horses and rode down together toward the ranch, where the chimney smoke was rising into the clear autumn sky. And inside the house, Tom Holloway would be demanding his breakfast, and Clara would be explaining her strongly held opinions about something to whoever was closest, and Caleb would be moving through the kitchen with his careful bad-kneed gait, and the whole warm living fact of their life would be beginning again. In the spring of 1890, a third child arrived, another son they named James Caleb Holloway, the second name chosen with deliberate intention. And when Mabel told Caleb what they had named the baby and watched the old man's weathered face try to rearrange itself around something too large for his usual composure, she reached over and pressed his arm briefly, and he cleared his throat and looked away for a moment. And nobody said anything, which was exactly right. Tom Holloway, 7 years old by then, appointed himself official protector and educator of his new brother from the first week, a role he took with a seriousness that made his father see himself in miniature and his mother see something uniquely Tom. Clara, 4, was willing to share her parents' attention with another sibling, but made it clear that her position in the family order was non-negotiable. And the new baby James, as though understanding this from birth, regarded his sister with an expression of amiable acceptance that suggested he was going to be easier in temperament than either of his siblings. The ranch in 1890 was a thriving enterprise, known in the county as one of the best-run operations along the creek corridor, which was a reputation built on 8 years of consistent competence and genuine care. The land that Pine had once tried to take was producing well. The herd was in excellent condition. The books were balanced and healthy. Andrew was 39 and Mabel was 34, and they had built something from the ground up together in the way that the best things are built, not in one dramatic gesture, but in the accumulated weight of 10,000 ordinary days, each one chosen and worked and lived. On an autumn evening in that year, Andrew came into the kitchen where Mabel was making the morning's bread dough ahead, the way she always did the evening before, and stood watching her work for a moment. The kitchen was warm and the lamplight was golden, and the house held the sounds of sleeping children and Caleb's distant quiet movement in his room off the back hall, where he had moved 2 years ago when his knees finally made the bunkhouse impractical. The ranch outside was still and perfect in the way of a fall evening. "What are you thinking about?" he said, leaning against the doorframe in the posture she had known for 8 years. She worked the dough and considered. "I was thinking about the notice," she said. "My notice. Yes, I was thinking about what you wrote, a cook in a hand, and I pulled it down and rode 12 miles and walked into your yard and you looked at me like you were not certain which of the two of us had made the error." He smiled. "I was not certain. I was leaning toward it being me." "And was it?" "Absolutely not," he said. "It was the best notice I ever posted." She laughed and turned back to the dough. "It was terrible handwriting." "It was legible, barely. You read it." "I read everything," she said, "even terrible handwriting." She shaped the loaves and covered them with a cloth and turned to face him, wiping her hands on her apron. He was watching her with that expression she knew the way she knew the ranch and the land and the creek and the cottonwoods, the warm, certain, complete expression of a man who is exactly where he belongs with exactly who he belongs with and knows it without reservation. She crossed the kitchen and he opened his arms and she walked into them, and they stood in the warm, lamplight kitchen of their house with the sleeping children in the rooms above and the autumn dark outside and the land they had defended and built and made their own spreading outward in all directions. And she thought about the woman who had pulled a notice down from a post in Caldwell on a spring morning and thought, clear and certain and entirely herself, that the work looked worth doing. It had been, every bit of it. Every fence post and pot of stew, an early morning ride, an evening of kitchen talk and year of building. Every moment of it had been worth every moment of it. She turned her face up to his, and he kissed her in the lamplight, warm and certain and utterly without distance, the way he had kissed her since that September evening, when they had said their vows in the little church with the fiddle music and the September gold. And she kissed him back with everything she was, this direct and capable and genuine woman who had ridden 12 miles to apply for work she was fully qualified for, and refused to take half of what she was worth. And who had found in that refusal and that ride and that folded notice the whole of a life she had not known to ask for, and would not trade for anything under that enormous Kansas sky. Outside, the plains ran on in their ancient and indifferent beauty, grass and stars and wind and dark, and inside the lamplight held, and the bread dough rose under its cloth, and Andrew Holloway held his wife, and Mabel Holloway let herself be held, and the Holloway ranch sat in its valley by its creek under its cottonwoods, in the full quiet richness of a life that had been built right and would last.